3 weeks away from losing my house. That's what the letter said. And for a few seconds, I actually believed it. I remember standing at my mailbox on a warm Tuesday morning, reading the words over and over while my coffee went cold in my hand. It said I owed thousands of dollars in unpaid HOA fees, late penalties, attorney costs, and foreclosure expenses. If I didn't pay everything within 30 days, they would begin taking my home. The funny part is, there wasn't a single unpaid dollar. My name is Evelyn Harper. I'm 73 years old. I've lived in Cedar Hollow outside Lexington, Kentucky, for almost 20 years, and after my husband Frank passed away 4 years ago, this little brick house became the last place that still felt like home. Every flower bed, every tree in the yard, every scratch on the porch railing has a memory attached to it. Frank and I paid off the mortgage years before he died. We worked too hard to ever owe anyone another payment, and I took pride in keeping every receipt, every canceled check, every bank statement neatly filed inside a metal cabinet in my study. Old habits die hard. Some people collect antiques. I collect paperwork. My granddaughter jokes that I probably have receipts from the Stone Age. That habit ended up saving me. At first I thought the foreclosure notice had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe the HOA accounting office mixed up addresses. Maybe somebody typed the wrong lot number. Mistakes happen. I wasn't angry yet. I was confused. I sat down at my dining room table, put on my reading glasses, and pulled out my files. January, paid. February, paid. March, paid. Every single monthly assessment had cleared my bank on time. I even had confirmation emails printed and clipped together because Frank always used to say, "The day you throw away a receipt is the day somebody claims you never paid." I smiled when I remembered him saying that. But that smile disappeared when I noticed the amount on the foreclosure notice. It wasn't just the regular dues. They had added late penalties, legal processing fees, collection charges, administrative costs. Somehow my account had ballooned into over $11,000. That wasn't a bookkeeping error. Somebody had built that number one fake charge at a time. So I called the HOA office. The receptionist answered politely enough and transferred me to the board president, Monica Calloway. I'd seen Monica around the neighborhood plenty of times. Mid-50s. Always dressed like she was running for mayor, always carrying a clipboard, always reminding somebody about garbage cans or lawn height or mailbox colors. She loved rules the way some people love grandchildren. "Mrs. Harper," she said before I even finished introducing myself, "I'm looking at your file right now." I explained that every payment had been made, that I had proof, and that there had to be a mistake. She let out this little laugh. Not loud, just enough to let me know she wasn't taking me seriously. "Well," she said, "sometimes people your age honestly believe they've paid bills when they haven't. It happens all the time." I sat there quietly for a second because I honestly wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. Then she continued, "Maybe you should let one of your children handle your finances from now on. These things can get confusing." I looked across the room at the picture of Frank sitting on our fishing boat 20 years ago. He used to tell me that the quickest way to understand someone's character was to watch how they treated people they thought couldn't fight back. Monica believed she was talking to a lonely old widow whose memory had started slipping. She had no idea she had just insulted the wrong person. I thanked her for her time, wished her a pleasant afternoon, and hung up before my temper got the better of me. Then I walked into my study, unlocked the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet, and took out a wooden presentation box that hadn't been opened in almost 3 years. Inside rested a simple judicial robe pin, a retirement plaque, and a photograph from my final day on the bench. For 26 years, I had served as an associate justice on the Kentucky Supreme Court, spending most of my career writing opinions involving property rights, civil procedure, and abuses of authority. Retirement had been peaceful. I gardened, spoiled my grandchildren, volunteered at the library, and enjoyed being forgotten. I liked that people saw an ordinary grandmother instead of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. Monica didn't know any of that. To her, I was simply another elderly homeowner she could pressure into paying money she didn't owe. I picked up the photograph, smiled to myself, and whispered, "Frank, I think things are about to get interesting." Then I opened a fresh legal pad, wrote 3 words across the top in careful block letters, "Evidence collection begins." And before the sun went down that evening, I had already made the first phone call that would eventually unravel something far bigger than a fake foreclosure notice. The first thing I learned after 26 years on the bench was that people rarely hide a lie in the lie itself. They hide it in the paperwork surrounding it, so while Monica probably expected me to spend my days arguing over one fake bill, I wasn't interested in proving I had paid $11,000 that I never owed. I wanted to know why someone had gone through so much trouble to invent that debt in the first place. The next morning, I mailed a formal response denying every allegation in the foreclosure notice, requesting every financial record connected to my property, every board meeting minute from the previous 5 years, every vote authorizing legal action, every collection agreement with outside attorneys, and every document that justified the charges against me. I knew exactly what I was asking for because I had written opinions forcing organizations to produce those same records decades earlier. 3 days later, my phone rang. Monica sounded different this time. Not friendlier, just irritated. "Mrs. Harper," she said, "there's really no need to make this complicated. If you'll just pay half now, we can work out the rest." I smiled because that sentence told me everything I needed to know. People don't negotiate debts that actually exist. "No," I answered calmly. "We'll let the documents speak for themselves." She sighed loudly. "You're making a mistake." "No," I replied. "I believe you're the one making it." She hung up without another word. 2 weeks passed before the HOA finally delivered several heavy boxes filled with records. At first glance, everything looked ordinary. Neat folders, organized spreadsheets, meeting minutes typed in the same format every month. Most people would have stopped there. I didn't. I spent 6 straight days sitting at my dining room table with colored sticky notes, highlighters, and legal pads spread everywhere. By the end of the second day, I noticed something odd. The signatures on several board meeting approvals looked almost identical. Not similar, identical. The angle of every letter, every flourish, every pause in the ink repeated itself with impossible precision. Human handwriting never does that. I called an old friend named Richard Sloan, a retired forensic document examiner I had known through countless trials years earlier. When he arrived, he laughed and said, "Evelyn, retirement clearly isn't agreeing with you if you've invited me over to study signatures again." 2 hours later, his smile disappeared. He adjusted his magnifying glass and quietly said, "These weren't signed by 6 different people. They were traced from the same source." That was the first crack in Monica's carefully built wall. The second came from another retired colleague, forensic accountant Daniel Price. Daniel spent nearly 40 years investigating financial fraud for state agencies before retiring. After reviewing only a handful of bank statements, he frowned. Something doesn't balance. He asked for every reserve account statement, vendor invoice, maintenance payment, and landscaping contract. A week later, he walked into my kitchen carrying a binder almost 3 inches thick. "You aren't dealing with accounting mistakes," he said. "You're looking at systematic theft." According to Daniel's report, nearly $74,000 had quietly disappeared over the previous 5 years through fake maintenance invoices, duplicate payments, non-existent consulting contracts, and checks issued to shell companies that shared mailing addresses with businesses connected to Monica's brother-in-law. Every missing dollar had been disguised well enough to escape casual review, but not detailed forensic analysis. The foreclosure against me suddenly made perfect sense. If someone was already stealing community money, the last thing they needed was a homeowner demanding financial transparency. Eliminating me through foreclosure would remove the one resident most likely to ask uncomfortable questions. I wasn't the target because I was weak. I was the target because they assumed I looked weak. That realization changed everything. Instead of defending myself, I began investigating the entire HOA. I started knocking on doors, not aggressively, just politely introducing myself, asking neighbors if they'd ever had billing problems. At first, most people looked uncomfortable. Nobody likes talking about conflicts with their HOA. Then one elderly veteran quietly invited me inside. He pulled out a folder containing thousands of dollars and unexplained penalties he'd eventually paid simply because he couldn't afford a lawsuit. A retired schoolteacher showed me legal threats she'd received over fees that appeared months after she sold her home. Another family confessed they refinanced their mortgage to avoid foreclosure over violations they never understood. One story became 3. 3 became 7. 7 became 13. Every conversation sounded strangely familiar. Confusing bills, sudden legal fees, pressure to settle quickly, threats of losing homes. Several homeowners admitted they paid simply because they believed the HOA always won. By the end of that month, I wasn't representing myself anymore. I'd become the unofficial voice for an entire neighborhood that had been intimidated into silence for years. We held our first meeting in the fellowship hall of a local church because nobody trusted using the clubhouse monitored by the HOA board. 21 homeowners showed up carrying binders, envelopes, banker boxes, even grocery bags stuffed with documents. One young couple apologized because they thought their paperwork looked messy. I told them something I used to tell nervous lawyers during oral arguments. Truth doesn't care whether it's organized. We'll organize it. We spent nearly 5 hours comparing timelines, payment histories, violation notices, and legal threats. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every questionable foreclosure seemed to involve homeowners who had previously questioned spending decisions, requested financial reports, or criticized Monica during board meetings. This wasn't random enforcement. It was retaliation disguised as governance. A week later, we received another surprise. One of the former HOA board members, Linda Carson, called asking if we could meet privately. She arrived carrying an old laptop and several flash drives. Linda confessed she resigned 2 years earlier after repeatedly being told to sign meeting minutes for meetings that never happened. When she refused, Monica stopped inviting her to board discussions altogether while continuing to list her as voting in favor of controversial decisions. Linda had quietly saved copies of emails instructing board members to sign first, ask questions later. Those emails became the missing link tying forged meeting minutes directly to Monica's office. Richard authenticated the signatures. Daniel traced the money. Linda explained the internal process. Suddenly, we weren't looking at suspicion anymore. We were looking at evidence that could survive a courtroom. The county clerk issued subpoenas. Depositions were scheduled. Monica's attorney immediately requested settlement discussions. The offer arrived on a Friday afternoon. They would cancel my foreclosure, erase every fee, and even pay $10,000 if I agreed to dismiss all claims and sign a confidentiality agreement. I actually laughed out loud reading it. They still thought this was about my house. It hadn't been about my house for weeks. I declined the offer within the hour. Monday morning, another letter arrived, this time warning that pursuing litigation could become expensive and emotionally exhausting for someone my age. I folded the letter neatly, placed it into the evidence binder, and whispered, "Thank you." Every attempt to intimidate me only strengthened the story we were preparing to tell. Finally, the hearing date arrived. The courthouse looked exactly as I remembered it. Polished marble floors, quiet hallways, lawyers carrying oversized briefcases, families waiting nervously outside courtrooms. I hadn't walked into that building as a litigant in decades. As I climbed the front steps carrying 3 evidence binders and a worn leather briefcase Frank had given me on my first day as a justice, I noticed Monica standing near the entrance wearing an expensive navy suit, smiling confidently while chatting with her attorney. She glanced at me, looked me up and down, and smirked as though she were about to watch another frightened widow surrender. I simply smiled back, adjusted the briefcase in my hand, and walked through the courthouse doors, knowing that within the next few minutes, everyone in that courtroom, including the judge himself, was about to discover exactly who I really was. The courtroom went quiet the moment the clerk called our case, and for a second, it felt strangely familiar, almost comforting. I'd spent more than half my adult life inside courtrooms, just never from the side of the room where I was standing that morning. The judge adjusted his glasses, glanced down at the file, then looked toward me with the same polite expression judges use 100 times a day. "Ma'am," he said, "would you please state your full name for the record?" I stood, straightened my jacket, and answered in the calm voice I'd used for thousands of proceedings over the years. "Evelyn Grace Harper, retired Associate Justice of the Kentucky Supreme Court." The room froze. The judge blinked once, then looked at me again before a slow smile crossed his face. "Justice Harper?" he asked. "Yes, Your Honor." He immediately stood from the bench, something that almost never happens during an ordinary civil hearing. "It is an honor to see you again. I studied several of your property law opinions during law school, and later relied on them when I first began practicing." I nodded politely. "Thank you, Judge." Across the courtroom, I heard a chair scrape against the floor. Monica's attorney leaned toward her, whispering something urgently, while the color slowly drained from her face. For the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, she looked uncertain, not because of who I had once been, but because she suddenly realized why I had never once acted intimidated. The hearing moved forward, and instead of speeches or dramatic arguments, we simply presented facts. First came my payment history. Every canceled check, every bank statement, every confirmation number lined up in perfect chronological order. Then Daniel explained his forensic accounting report, carefully walking the court through the missing funds, the shell companies, the duplicate invoices, and the money that quietly disappeared year after year. Richard followed with enlarged photographs comparing genuine signatures to the forged board approvals. Even someone with no legal training could see the differences once he explained them. Finally, Linda testified under oath about meetings that had never happened, votes that had never been taken, and instructions to sign documents after decisions had supposedly already been approved. Monica's attorney tried to argue that these were merely administrative mistakes, but every explanation seemed to create two more questions. Then the judge looked directly at Monica. "Mrs. What access wants sheet Calloway?" he asked evenly. "Can you provide this court with the original board authorization approving foreclosure against Mrs. Harper's property?" Monica shuffled through her folder, glanced toward her attorney, then back at the judge. I believe it's included somewhere in the records." The judge waited. Silence filled the courtroom. "Can you identify the meeting where that vote occurred?" Another pause. "No, Your Honor." "Can you explain why multiple board members deny attending that meeting?" No answer. "Can you explain why the signatures appear to have been traced?" Still nothing. Finally, the judge closed the file in front of him. "This court finds no legal basis supporting the foreclosure action. The notice is hereby dismissed with prejudice." You could almost feel the air leave the room, but he wasn't finished. Furthermore, based upon the evidence presented today, the court orders these findings forwarded to the Office of the Attorney General for review of potential criminal violations, including fraud, forgery, and financial misconduct. Monica lowered her head. She never looked in my direction again. Over the following months, the investigation expanded far beyond my original complaint. State investigators interviewed former board members, subpoenaed financial institutions, and executed search warrants for business records connected to the HOA's vendors. The evidence only grew stronger. Criminal charges eventually followed, including fraud, forgery, theft by deception, and embezzlement. Several contractors agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, revealing how invoices had been inflated and kickbacks quietly distributed for years. In civil court, the HOA's insurance carrier reached settlements with numerous homeowners who had suffered financial losses because of the fraudulent practices. I recovered my legal expenses, compensation for the damage done to my reputation, and additional punitive damages. But if I'm being honest, the money never mattered very much. What mattered was watching neighbors who had spent years feeling powerless finally stand a little taller. Some of them told me they had almost sold their homes because they believed they could never beat the HOA. Others admitted they had lived with constant anxiety every time another envelope arrived in the mailbox. Those letters stopped. A new board was elected. Independent audits became mandatory. Financial reports were published openly. The community slowly became what it should have been all along. A neighborhood instead of a business built on fear. Every now and then someone asked me if Monica would have treated me differently had she known I was a retired justice. Maybe she would have, but that's never been the question that stays with me. The question I still think about is how many ordinary people she believed she could bully simply because they didn't have my legal background. Justice shouldn't depend on who understands the law better. It should protect everyone equally, especially the people who can't afford to fight alone. So I'd love to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have accepted the settlement and quietly walked away? Or would you have pushed until the entire truth came out, even knowing it could take months of your life? Let me know in the comments, because stories like this always spark strong opinions, and I'm genuinely curious where you stand. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real-life justice stories, and share it with someone who believes no one should ever be above the law, no matter what title they hold.